the main defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that Feuerbach included, is that the object, actuality, sensuousness, are conceived only in the form of the object, or of contemplation, but not as human sensuous activity, practice, not subjectively. Hence it happened that the active side, in opposition to materialism, was developed by idealism, but only abstractly, since, of course, idealism does not know real, sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects, differentiated from thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. In the essence of Christianity, he therefore regards the theoretical attitude as the only genuine human attitude, while practice is conceived and defined only in its dirty Jewish form of appearance. Hence, he does not grasp the significance of revolutionary, of practical, critical activity. Well, finally, the first video of Marx's Theses of Feuerbach has finally come about. And to start it all off, we get a hard-hitting section right away, which, in any case, can distort someone in the get-go if one blazes through the entire work without stopping to smell the roses. Admittedly, this is a short work. In fact, they were at first notes for what will later be used in a work called German Ideology, and also later fleshed upon to be full-fledged essays on Feuerbach that Engels compiled in his work called Feuerbach, the roots of the socialist philosophy. So, let's stop moping around these details, and let's get to seeing what Marx's notion, Begriff, is in all this note-taking that we can clearly see here. Now, before I go on explaining this entire first thesis, I'd like to remark his following theses will further expand upon it and clarify the first thesis. In fact, he then takes the conclusion of those following theses to pronounce one of the many famous aphorisms of Marx, that being, thankfully enough, his last thesis. But more on that actually later down the road. And one more side note, what I probably should have mentioned explicitly and emphasized in the How to Read Marx's and Engels' works, everything that an author writes down is done with a purpose, and reflects to some part the authors themselves and their perception of the world as they saw it in the time of their writing. Now, with those in mind, I will focus solely on what is stated here for all the following sections as per usual, lest something has to be clarified before moving forward. And if they are clarified, I will give the greatest of honors that very clarification needs. Let's start with the Pradas Statement Marx outright blurts out and spends a great chunk of the work defending and expanding in the meanwhile. That is, his first sentence. Materialism, at the time he was jotting down notes on Feuerbach, had a problem that was rooted in its underlying structure, it conceived the object, actuality, sensuousness, as merely products of thought or contemplation. In its opposition was that of human sensuous activity or praxis, as was championed by people and philosophers and scientists like Marx and Engels and Darwin and the such. But let that just sink in for a while and let the passions stir a bit. Now, how is that the case that it was that instead of originally being the conclusion, the definition of materialism during Marx's time? That question is already a loaded one and presupposes that materialism has been all its life either a bastardization of itself or secretly leading up to Marx and his materialism, albeit the contingencies do actively and retroactively presuppose their purpose. So, let's make distinct of three types of universal materialisms right now: philosophical materialism, metaphysical materialism, and dialectical materialism. Philosophical materialism is a universality of all types of materialism, going back to the day of atomic Epicurean materialism, to the days of metaphysical materialism, to even include particulars like dialectical materialism. Now, metaphysical materialism, as seen, at least nowadays, is divided into two major particulars: the actual bastardization that will later be qualified as 19th century idealism, and the other, a materialism that isn't in line with dialectics. And now, we get to the last distinction, of course: dialectical materialism, that being the materialism that Marx and Engels were principally co-influencing together, which later on will be coined. But that's within, the 20th century, in 20th century philosophy. So, let's get back to the question: how did Marx identify it, the rot, as such? Getting back to our distinctions, it really shows itself to be 19th century idealism, the type of idealism that knew its foundations were shaky after the creation of absolute idealism of Hegel's, that being a dialectical idealism for one to keep in mind, and as such, they uploaded their base with what philosophical materialism had developed into so far up until the 19th century, even including recent inventions and discoveries of science at that point. But in that very motion, they turn around to use all that to further justify their claims and philosophical idealism. And while naming conventions hadn't been a real concern for the past that much, if we were to purposely exclude the bloody history up until that point, 19th century idealists had no agreement on what to call themselves, nor any real contingent focus on what to explore philosophically. As such, 19th century idealism is more or less a naming convention nowadays that contains all the particularities of those days, which relates to idealism, at least in a supporting way, of course. Yet materialism likened to Feuerbach's were certainly affected by such, and this is where Marx makes his next statement on what the actual defect is, what the rot in hitherto existing materialism is, that this materialism's active organs, sensuousness and whatnot, was developed and reinforced by idealism. But idealism can only look at abstractions and never the particular or actual sensuous activities. Yet, of course, Feuerbach had known of this defect as well, but couldn't escape it when trying to differentiate sensuous objects from thought objects. In fact, Feuerbach had mistakenly misconceived practical activities in this very differentiation, which the more is clarified in Feuerbach's magnum opus, The Essence of Christianity, that theory is genuine human activity and practical activity as a slur of theory, which in that case he did fail to see and grasp what revolutions and revolutionary activity is. As a side note, before we move on to the next section, Europe by that time of mid-19th century politics was still heavily anti-Semitic, especially in the German areas all throughout this time, where politicians will use the mythical stereotype of Jews to get their seats. Mind you that both Marx and Feuerbach were German. Yet what Marx said in this section was a call-out to what essentially Feuerbach is claiming practical activity is. And mind you, Marx technically is a Jew by familial relations. But he doesn't talk about it, being a Jew and whatnot, that much, except in rare cases like this, and in later works down the line. So he had to keep it quiet of any mentions to Judaism and ethnic Jews. But this topic of anti-Semitism can get a whole video dedicated to it due to how broad the movement was and the varying tragedies and farces of those tragedies was in that very movement, which affected the world as such. Yet, with all this being said, don't be surprised that 19th century philosophers, or any precursors before such, has any anti-Semitic beliefs, but don't accept such and challenge such beliefs. The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. Men must prove the truth, it is the reality and power, the decideness of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking which is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question. Now another hard-hitting section, but not as tough as the one before it. As aforementioned, it's all clarifications of the first theses from this point on. Also aforementioned, a careful reading of what Marx is putting down can easily reveal what Marx has to actually say and what he means. So, let's see what Marx has to say about objective truth as such in connection to human thinking. Objective truth in relation to human thought, for Marx, as stated, can only be revealed in a practical way. If you want to fancy an example, think of lab coat science or hard science for a moment. If I want to prove that a rubber ball has perfect elasticity, then I run trials with the only modification between each version of the experiment being the height itself. If the ball returns to the drop height, whence dropped, while conceding to reasonable limits where the acceleration due to gravity doesn't change significantly between the different variations of those drop heights, then I can prove the ball is objectively elastic, and more or less perfectly elastic. Of course, removing the limits, of reasonable drop height, and dropping the ball from the atmosphere, exempli gratia, and expecting it to come back is unreasonable, because the force of gravity is greatly affected by how far away you are from the Earth and how much closer you are with other celestial bodies of different masses. Of course, a celestial body being a star or a planet, a comet, and so on and so on. Now, coming back to what Marx had to say for just a bit, Marx wants to declare that if objective truth can be attributed to human thinking, it can only be proved by praxis, by practice or practical activities. And more importantly, it cannot be proven by theory, at least not alone. Again, to go back to the elasticity of a rubber ball, we can utilize many established laws and theories of physics. Note there is a distinction between the two that I won't clarify here, for the sake of brevity, ironically enough. And such laws and theories can prove a general rubber ball should be perfectly elastic. But until lab coat science has the data, the empirical proof, to prove that yes, this ball is perfectly elastic within these confined limits of actual usage, we will be queasy if the ball is perfectly elastic or not. In fact, without practical knowledge, theoretical knowledge is all either empty in itself or pure sophistry. Thus, if human thinking is put to the test and doesn't ask the guidance of practice, it is purely scholastic. Now, scholastic isn't a term that is often used, both in common tongue and in academic tongues, unless of course you're to go out of your way to find an academic that knows of scholasticism, then you're not going to hear that often. So, let me outline some superficial history and superficial understandings of the philosophy as such. Scholasticism, or medieval scholasticism actually, that Marx is referencing here, was a predominantly huge school of thought during the medieval era that dominated schools of philosophy, though mainly the philosophy of religion, of course. Two huge figures within the European world that can be considered scholastics or Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas that had huge implications all throughout medieval Europe and medieval Middle East. Albeit, I want to make these two things clear right now. St. Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced and interacted heavily with Arabian scholars, and what Aquinas and Augustine talked about were within the same confines of knowledge, but they had drastic influence elsewhere in the scholastic world itself. With Aquinas being famous in the philosophy of religion and general theology, and Augustine in the philosophy of law, while mainly striking a massive chord in the philosophy of religion as well. So, Marx's whole statement there about scholasticism can be interpreted in this ambiguous, it est, double meaning function. This may be a complicated religious joke that Marx just threw out there, and at the same time can also be interpreted as a condemnation of the limits of scholasticism in terms of its areas of inquiry and how it studied these areas of inquiry. The materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that, therefore, changed men are products of changed circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men who change circumstances and that the educator must himself be educated. Hence, this doctrine is bound to divide society into two parts, one of which is superior to society, the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-change can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice. Now, this is the first thesis to actually branch out and have a serious development, while still being a clear expansion of the first thesis in general. But let's actually see what Marx is saying here about the role of contingencies and the role of humanity, albeit I see this as a clear theoretical grounds for contingencies to be taken seriously, of course. Now, for those that forgot what contingencies were already from the previous Half-Hour Marx and Engels series on Engels' Principles of Communism, or are new people to the channel and somehow are still sticking along, let me redevelop it again as such, regardless of who you are. Contingencies are the necessary element for a dialectical motion to continue moving and developing. That is to say, they are random events that happen due to conditions giving rise to them, or just appearing out of the blue, that helps the dialectical motion to continue on and process where to develop next. All contingencies are blind to the concept of good and evil and will muck about where it pleases until it is fully developed and led about what it retroactively presupposed that justified its existence. And mind you, because of the inclusion of contingencies in dialectics and historical materialism cannot be viewed in a linear motion, only in a helical motion. But that was explained in previous videos, So I suggest you actually look at those videos right now and listen to them right now. In which case, this leads to the discussion of material conditions, actually. See, material conditions are the culmination of contingencies that is led up to the point of time, and also a point in time that generates more contingencies as its base. See, material conditions do what it can within the limits of how much it possesses in itself to support any contingency coming about from itself. But if it cannot support a contingency, it shall not happen, lest it be a pure accident that it came about, but nobody knows the reason why. But material conditions do not tie down humans to solely stay there and not change anything. It just sets the limits for what humanity is currently right now, and where humanity can expand further than it previously had seen or thought before. For what has to come about can simply be annihilated if given the right people and the right developments to allow for such annihilation. For, to quote Marx, in the eyes of dialectical philosophy, nothing is established for all times, nothing is absolute or sacred. In which case, the march of history, the material conditions, the destiny of humankind, and so on, are all clearly steerable, for the flow of matter allows itself to be changed if given enough force to be compelled to change. But what Marx isn't saying here is that humanity can simply just muck about and be what it wants to be because they thought it. That would be pure idealism if that were the case, and Marx clearly doesn't agree things can be eliminated in one stroke. In which case, to change the world, one must do. How one becomes is a lot of chains of previous doings and previous becomings that the one person has superseded up until that point, and will supersede that very becoming once again once that person does something to undo his previous becoming in any way, shape, or form of action. It is, after all, dialectics, and the dialectics refuses to stay put.